The following presentation will help get you through a short answer response. This fits the Florida State Standards for 6th grade, RI 1.1, Cite Textual Evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. RI 1.2, Determine a central idea of the text and how it is conveyed through particular details. Provide a summary of the text distinct from personal opinion or judgments. RI 1.3, Analyze in detail how a key individual, event, or idea is introduced, illustrated, and elaborated in a text. W2.4, Produce clear and coherent writing in which the development, organization, and style are appropriate to task, purpose, and audience. W2.5, With some guidance and support from peers and adults, develop and strengthen writing as needed by planning, revising, editing, rewriting, or trying a new approach. At this point, you should have already read the article, Fairy Tales Could Be Older Than You Ever Imagined, from the link above. So we're going to try and answer the question, what process did researchers use to trace the history of fairy tales? We're going to try to answer this question using an acronym known as SLAM. SLAM stands for turning the question into a sentence that includes your answer, locating evidence from the text to support your answer, analyze why the evidence proves your answer, and make a meaningful conclusion that summarizes your paragraph. So looking at S, we first need to turn the question into a sentence that includes our answer. So we're going to remove the question words what and did and remove the question mark. Our example could be the process researchers used to trace the history of fairy tales was, and then we're going to add our answer, a technique borrowed from biologists called phylogenetic analysis. And because it's a term that's directly taken from the text and not one that I would have known on my own, I had to put quotes around that. Then we're going to try to locate some evidence to support what our answer is. Remember, we are not experts on the dating of fairy tales. We don't have any experience trying to decide how old they are. So we need the help of somebody who is an expert that we're taking from this article. That's going to help prove our answer and help give us some credibility. So we want to make sure that that evidence is relevant. And we want to make sure that we're not repeating ourselves over and over again. You only need to use a portion of the sentence, but make sure you use quotes and an ellipses if it's not the entire sentence that you're quoting. So our example could be, according to the text, researchers used strategies created by evolutionary biologists to trace the roots of 275 fairy tales through complex trees of language, population, and culture. Notice that everything in quotes came directly word for word from the text. Then we need to analyze or explain why that evidence proves our answer. Sometimes this requires more than one sentence. So here's an example. By retracing the roots of the language of the stories, researchers were able to find the same stories in older versions of the language. For instance, a story told in English can also be found in Old English. Since Old English was used within a particular period of time, researchers can date the story to that time era. It's important that you explain why your quote explains your answer, because without that, you're assuming that people read that the same way that you did, and it may not make sense to them. They may not feel like your evidence proves anything. Finally, we need to make a meaningful conclusion that summarizes our paragraph. There are a couple options here. The first one, you could just summarize your opening sentence. So for example, by borrowing techniques from biologists, researchers have effectively been able to trace back the roots of fairy tales and discovered they could be considerably older than originally thought. Or option 2, finalize with your own thoughts. What is your own opinion on what you read? It's interesting to think that the stories I grew up with are the same stories my great-great-grandparents would have known as well. So our finished paragraph is going to consist of all of our little sentences that we made using our SLAM. We're going to combine them into one finished paragraph. So our example, the process researchers used to trace the history of fairy tales was a technique borrowed from biologists called phylogenetic analysis. According to the text, researchers used strategies created by evolutionary biologists to trace the roots of 275 fairy tales through complex trees of language, population, and culture. By retracing the roots of the language of the stories, researchers were able to find the same stories in older versions of the language. For instance, a story told in English can also be found in Old English. Since Old English was used within a particular period of time, researchers can date the story to that time era. By borrowing techniques from biologists, researchers have effectively been able to trace back the roots of fairy tales and discovered they could be considerably older than originally thought. Notice how all of these sentences flow together. So before you submit, make sure you reread those finished sentences and make sure that they become one good solid paragraph. They have to make sense together. Also make sure that you're checking for capitalization and spelling. You don't ever want to turn in something that is incomplete or looks like you really didn't reread what you wrote. Make sure it doesn't sound funny or repetitive. Sometimes we get so hung up on finding evidence and explaining that evidence that we just tend to repeat the same thing over and over again. Finally, make sure you use proper punctuation. Thanks for watching. I hope this helped you with your short answer responses.